All right, are we live? Michael, you want me to kick it off?
Yeah, we're live. It'd be great.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Charlie Bachtel, CEO of Cresco Labs, and I'm also the co-chair of the ATACH Capital Markets Council. ATACH's Capital Markets Council is engaged in cannabis market activity and works to help open up access to capital markets through traditional financing. As an organization, we continue to advocate for major financial securities markets, such as the NYSE and NASDAQ, to list plant-touching U.S. cannabis operators and for access to capital for businesses across the entire cannabis ecosystem. Today, we're going to shed some light on what the federal rescheduling of cannabis will actually mean for day-to-day cannabis operations, both small and large operators, and the impact the U.S. cannabis capital markets in general. We also hope to strike a broader dialogue surrounding the actual process of rescheduling and what it means to the broader cannabis market. While President Biden has suggested cannabis should be rescheduled, and HHS recently recommended cannabis to be moved down to Schedule 3, we all know the details are rooted in both processes and politics, which we will dissect. Michael Bronstein, the president of the American Trade Association for Cannabis and Hemp, ATACH, is going to be moderating today's panel. Like you and ATACH's Capital Markets Council and ATACH's Coalition for Cannabis Scheduling Reform, I want to thank you for hosting today's call. Michael, no pressure, but as I always say, a panel is only as good as its moderator. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Michael.
It's great. Thank you, Charlie, and thank you for your leadership on the council and for what you're doing for the broader industry. Today, it's a real privilege to welcome all of you here. Just to let you know, we have a number of financial analysts as well as members of our Capital Markets Council and members of the media. Just so everybody knows, this conversation is being recorded and is on the record. So I just wanted to let you know as we move into this conversation. The Scheduling Reform Coalition's been advocating for well over a year now, and been excited about the work that's gone on through that. We believe it's the right move. It's a crucial time to engage businesses here, as Charlie was saying. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Adam Goers of the Cannabis Company and also the co-chair for the Coalition for Cannabis Scheduling Reform. Andrew Klein of Perkins Coie, and a former policy advisor to then Vice President Biden, as well as Howard Sklamberg of Arnold and Porter, and former FDA Deputy Commissioner for Global Regulatory Operations and Compliance. We're really thrilled to have you here to talk through this issue and gain more insight. And I'd just like to start here with Howard and Andrew. Let's discuss what the actual pathway to reform is here, and what's needed to happen. What happens what can we expect on the timeline? What does this mean in terms of a 280E potentially? What type of scheduling would be needed? Take us a little bit through that process. Andrew, I'll turn it over to you to sort of take us through the beginning part of the process.
Happy to do it. Thanks, Michael. Before I start, let me just say that we all owe a debt of gratitude to Charlie and John Sullivan, Adam Goers. There'll be a handful of people, I think, that at the end of the day, we're going to need to thank. But Charlie's going to be at the top of that list for getting this thing started. So you asked about the pathway to reform. From my perspective, you're looking at it. Schedule 3 fixes 280E. I think we should put that in a bumper sticker somewhere. Schedule 2 does not. So for us in the coalition for this industry, it's Schedule 3 or bust. Scott Greiper, president of Viridian, earlier this week said we should all be praying for rescheduling. And I'm not a particularly religious guy, but I got to say he was 1,000% correct, because this is how we're going to right this ship. Of course, everyone in the cannabis industry wants descheduling. Our coalition wants descheduling. Everyone I know in this industry wants descheduling. but we need to accept that legalization is not going to happen through this administrative process, full legalization. It can't, because the FDA did not find and could not find that there's zero abuse potential. But that should not take away from this moment. This is not just an opportunity to fix 280E. It's the only opportunity for real cannabis reform in the near term. We need some wind in our sails, and this is it. Instead of paying an effective 80% tax rate, companies are going to be paying an ordinary 21% tax rate. And you don't need to be a mathematician to see that this is going to create profitability overnight. I think Adam's going to talk about that a bit. But it's not just that shareholders are going to become wealthy. It's also a public safety imperative from my perspective. The non-regulated segments of this industry don't share the same public safety imperatives as the state-regulated industry. So as a public policy matter, we should all be supporting Schedule 3 and the state-regulated industry. And so, I'm really looking forward to this conversation and getting people to the place where they understand that this is a really, really good thing.
Howard, what do we expect out of this process? Where have we been? Where are we going? What can we expect out of this, having been through it before on the other side?
Well, I'd say also thank you all for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I would say, where we've gone, first, to echo what Andrew has said, is a giant step in the right direction, and one that probably, 4 years ago, most people would not have foreseen. So I think we ought to acknowledge that the FDA and HHS's recommendation for Schedule 3 is a big deal, and it signals a reevaluation by the nation's public health agencies about what the proper scope is for cannabis regulation, and kind of a fresh look at the science of it. And I know, as Andrew says, a lot of people who are listening would have preferred descheduling. That was never going to be in the cards under this regulatory framework, which governs not just cannabis, but all controlled substances, including FDA's drug program. So I always thought that Schedule 3 was about the best outcome that one could get under this framework. And so I think that's sort of where we've come. Under the relevant statute, kind of the process going forward is that the scientific recommendation by HHS and FDA is to be given deference by DEA. So they're not supposed to redo the science. DEA is the final decision maker, but they're supposed to take the science as a given and then look at other policy factors that are part of this 8-factor analysis that is in the statute. And they will then issue their proposed rule on this, which will indicate what DEA says it's going to do. There will then be a comment period, including most likely a public hearing. And then there will be a final rule, and then there may be litigation challenging that. And I would, there's no guarantee about what the time frame in this would be. I would be really shocked if it took DEA longer than the second quarter of next year to come up with its final rule. It is, it's aware of the the end of the administration. I mean, President Biden may be reelected, may not be, but they would want to get it done in 2024, and they would not want to get it done, practically speaking, in the run-up to an election. That's just not how agencies work. And I'm not saying DEA is going to be political in any kind of inappropriate way, but even when I was at FDA, we knew that important regulations that you wanted to get done in an election year, you want to get done by the summer before the Office of Management Budget. The rest of the White House apparatus is all busy pretty much in campaign mode, not actually campaigning, but getting sucked into all the political demands. So I would expect it to be done in that time frame. And there are no guarantees to an outcome. I think there's the question that opponents of rescheduling would cite the treaty, the convention, and would say that that should mean it cannot be scheduled other than Schedule 1 or Schedule 2. I think a lot of people disagree with that. I personally would be surprised if DEA did not agree ultimately with FDA and HHS's decision. I have no reason to believe that they coordinated this in any kind of overt way or any kind of inappropriate way. But it certainly would be strange in an issue that is such an important priority for the administration for one part of the administration to, in effect, reverse what another one has said. So those are my overall thoughts.
Those are good points, and thank you. And Adam, as I was listening Howard talk, I was wondering, as you see it, what the impact on state regulated businesses would be on this, and how you view the landscape after a potential decision, say a recommendation of a Schedule 3 would take place.
Well, first of all, thank you, Andrew and Howard, for your continued help on this issue, and Michael, to you and Charlie and others that have shown a lot of leadership in helping support the administration through this process. It will be super impactful, and it's going to be positively impactful. One of the things I would say is, for people too that have fear of what the unknown ahead would be in Schedule 3, is that companies will break Schedule 3 law in state regulated markets, just like they do Schedule 1 today, except much more enthusiastically without 280E over our heads. And that's going to be impactful for companies big and small, social equity and otherwise, and particularly for companies that are not vertically integrated. Through vertical integration, many companies have been able to, push aside some of the 280E hit. But as we look to states like New York and New Jersey and others to come that are trying to put forward social equity programs, 280E is really the piece that's making a lot of progress impossible. And so one might argue that, sole dispensary owners or owning a handful, as New York allows, are going to be some of the biggest winners through a Schedule 3 result. And I think for an industry, as Andrew alluded to earlier, that is competing not only with the legacy industry, but also with intoxicating hemp products, both sides of which are unregulated, both sides of which are untaxed, both sides of which do not go through the same rigor and age gating that state programs do, that the legal marketplace is going to be able to better compete. And that's one of the promises that has been made through legalization, is not only that an industry is set up so that adults 21 and up can get access to cannabis, but so that we can take away all the other problems, which were the disproportionate criminal justice penalties, so that we can refocus law enforcement to be focused on areas that are really impactful. So 280E is going to be a major positive impact. And it's going to increase, I think, the opportunity, again, for entrepreneurs in the delivery space that have been unable to get in under the weight of 280E. And then finally, for all of us, and I know Howard and Andrew have alluded to this as well, right? We all want legalization, and it can't come soon enough. I'm hopeful that, to use Andrew's words, that this is going to put more wind in the sails of reform, so that we can more quickly get to the end state that we want, which is full federal legalization. But this is certainly a really impactful, step along that progress.
And in what has been going on in terms of the effort from an industry side and the way that folks view it, and I think what are important, for those who are monitoring the financial markets around cannabis, and also overall the broader view is that there's advocacy going on around this, around this point as well. I was wondering, Adam, if you could talk a little bit about that advocacy from the coalition side, and what's being done by businesses who are in the marketplace that do want to see this change.
Well, one, we have to recognize and acknowledge that President Biden is the sole person that put this motion, or put this progress in motion, this process in motion. What the Coalition for Cannabis Scheduling Reform through ATACH has been doing is, one, communicating with all the relevant stakeholders and also policy and decision makers through this process to make sure that they've had the best state level data possible as FDA and HHS were going through that process, ensuring that relevant agencies are appropriately briefed on this. We're having this call today with 60 some odd folks that understand the ups and downs and the realities of the cannabis marketplace. We have to also acknowledge that many folks and policymakers don't have the same understanding. And so a lot of this effort has been educational, both to industry members to know what a Schedule III change would mean, but also to the relevant policymakers, both in Congress and the White House and in the states, as to what this positive impact would be. And also through that, not giving up for a moment that, our end goal is to legalize cannabis, but that this is a step along the way. So we've been engaging in lobbying, polling to understand voter attitudes on this. We saw the Gallup poll released yesterday, which shows that 70% of Americans are supportive of legalization. And the numbers above and beyond 70% of Americans that want cannabis to be reclassified. And that's exactly what Schedule III would do. Americans don't understand, as we know from the polling, that cannabis should be more strictly classified than fentanyl. It just doesn't make sense. So these are a lot of the different pieces of the work of the Coalition for Cannabis Scheduling Reform.
Howard, we have spent a lot of time sort of thinking through what it might mean, for public companies, for smaller companies on this. Some folks have speculated, and I've seen you comment, or talk a little bit about this before, but there's concern as to, the marketplace as it exists right now. If there was a movement to Schedule III, that this might impede a state level marketplace, because FDA would look to regulate there. What do you make of that? What do you make of those views? Do you see an impact just on a scheduling decision from that, or from where you sat looking from the enforcement role and compliance, whether those are things that folks should be particularly worried about right now? Say that they're a state level business or a publicly traded company that owns state level entities.
I do not think that people should be worried at all about any kind of increased FDA enforcement role with respect to state cannabis programs based on the change in schedule to Schedule III. And I can't be more emphatic about that. And just by way of background, the reason that cannabis violates the statute that FDA polices, which is the Federal Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, really has nothing to do whether it's in Schedule I or Schedule III, or even if it was descheduled. That's those are separate issues. The reason that in FDA's view, cannabis products violate the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act is that they are, in the medical world, they're unapproved drugs. And they claim to treat conditions. They affect the structure and function of the body. And in that category, they would say they violate the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act. FDA would also say as cannabis, when it is added to food, would violate the food provisions of the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act because it's not an approved food additive, and the same with dietary supplements. All those things are true, regardless of where cannabis is scheduled and regardless of whether it's scheduled. If it were descheduled, those things would be true. And indeed, FDA takes that view with respect to hemp-based CBD products, which are not scheduled, which FDA says cannot make drug claims, and FDA says are illegal additives to food, and FDA says are illegal, cannot be in dietary supplements. Now, the industry disagrees with that, but that's FDA's view. So FDA, despite thinking these things, has not taken action even against cannabis, even in Schedule 1. Well, why is that? It's not an accident, and there are a few reasons. One is the appropriations provision that affects DOJ regarding the Rohrabacher-Farr Amendment, basically saying that DOJ's money cannot be spent interfering with medical cannabis programs. DOJ is FDA's litigator, and while that language is not written directly for FDA, it affects FDA. But even if that language didn't exist, FDA has not intervened in state medical cannabis programs since they started in the 90s. So we're talking about a decision by a federal regulatory agency not to do something that has been consistent for over 20 years through all different kinds of administrations, both in the fairly distant past and more recently. And the reason for that is in the state medical area, and FDA will never say this quite explicitly, but they're basically saying state regulators do have standards that they apply in this area, and they police it. In the recreational area, as an additive to food, the problem is, were FDA to say, we want to take enforcement action against chocolate or gummy bears that contain cannabis. Legally, they would have to find a company to take action against. They would have to then go to court, and it would be a resource-intensive process. That would be a diversion of resources, of food safety resources, from FDA's core activity, which is keeping our seafood safe, keeping our produce safe, keeping our processed food safe, making sure everything that people have on their dinner table is safe. There are not many FDA commissioners who are interested in diverting resources from traditional food safety to this. And it's a decision, again, that they have made and have stuck by for years. And the way to think about it is, FDA has as much authority under Schedule 3 as it has with cannabis, to take action against cannabis under Schedule 3 as it would under Schedule 1. The change from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 reflects an FDA decision that cannabis presents less of a public health risk now than FDA thought it did years ago. Why, if there's less of a public health risk, would all of a sudden FDA step up its enforcement? So it makes no sense to think that. It makes no sense just logically. It makes no sense from the perspective of being consistent in your enforcement priorities, and it makes no sense from a resource allocation perspective, not to mention a small p political perspective, which is to say that if FDA were to take action against cannabis-containing chocolate sold by a dispensary in Denver, that dispensary would say, why are you going after me and not the thousands of others? And FDA would have to have an answer for that. And if FDA wanted to do that, it all of a sudden would own the issue. And it would be, you can't own an issue like this just a little bit. You own it all. And it would then be in the business of being the cannabis regulator at a cost of not doing other things. So it's a view I feel rather strongly about, and I think it's a worry that people have that I think is completely unwarranted.
I appreciate that, Howard, and the explanation. Andrew, since Howard talked a little bit about touched a little bit on politics, I want to ask you, if you were looking at this from administrative side and some of the politics as you've been, in those types of positions, how would you, how do you view it? And I would just ask that, we'll have a minute here and hopefully open up to Q&A after that. But I just, want to ask you if you could, if you could fill in a little bit of what that political thought is there.
Yeah, look, I have been saying for a long time now that I believe and continue to believe that cannabis reform is inextricably intertwined with democratic politics. No one, I think 10 years ago would have predicted that it would have been Joe Biden that would have initiated this process, but it was. And it's this administration, it's Democrats in the House, it's Democrats in the Senate largely who have been standing up for reform. So, I think we're betting a little bit on the come here and hoping that we're going to see another Democratic administration, because I do believe that cannabis reform will see better days with Democrats in office. Do you want me to comment at all about a little bit more about the process, Michael, or do you think we've covered enough there?
I think we've done well to cover cover where we see that process. I think that one of the and we'll open up to Q&A shortly. And what I would just say for our Q&A segment, if you just want to put your questions in the chat box, and if you identify which organization you're from in there, we'll get to we'll get to them and read them out to our distinguished panel here. And also we'll prioritize media and analysts as well for those questions. So I know there's some of our Capital Markets Council folks on here, but just want to make sure that it's that the questions are able to be asked. Okay, great. So the first question, if you could see from Ben here, I'm a senior editor, met him around a moment. Curious if any of you saw comments. Senior State Department legal advisor, UN Commission last month took a fairly permissive reading of international drug conventions with respect to domestic policy. If so, how do you interpret those comments? Is it a sign that the administration is trying to get ahead of the drug treaty conversations that Howard mentioned? Howard, maybe you want to answer that question?
I did see the comments, and I'll give an answer that will be not very definitive so there one or two things. When you have an official in an agency, in this case the State Department, who's not the terribly high level decision maker, but is somebody in the area, one of two things is happening, which is either the person is just kind of speaking off the cuff, or it's deliberate, and we don't know which. And when I worked at FDA, I will say I did both, and sometimes a mistake. But the comment can only be read as either not meaning much or helpful, depending upon it's more likely helpful. And you can interpret what the State Department official said as saying, like, well, we're looking to interpret the treaty as really only affecting how we scheduling decisions insofar as they would affect the international posture of the U.S. as opposed to the internal workings of our state markets. That would be the most logical reading of it, and that, of course, would be helpful. I think most of the folks who are more of an expert in the treaty issue than I am would say that basically, the treaty is not. There are plenty of ways of interpreting the convention that would present no obstacle to changing to Schedule 3. And there are some lawyers who would disagree with that, but I think, to put it in a results-oriented way, I think if DEA wanted to get to Schedule 3, it could, and it could use the logic that State Department official used. So I just can't say whether that's policy, whether that's kind of a bit of a leak or an augur of what policy will be, or just somebody speaking off the cuff.
Charlie,
Add in one piece on that too, Michael, to add in. I think what the comment was is consistent with some of the things that we've been hearing out of the U.S. State Department, though, in recent months, though, too. So, Howard has a better grasp of the process they're in, but I do want to point that out, that it was a welcome surprise to us, but consistent with what we have been generally hearing from them.
Charlie, I had a question come to me as well, for you, asking, asking if, what the impact of 280E you think means to the broader market, as well as the capital markets. Should you see a Schedule 3 decision? Are there things that you're preparing for? Are there things that you're seeing the industry prepare for, or even even some of the other companies that are out there? As a CEO of a company, how are you thinking about this?
Sure. I would say there's pretty broad implications for the impact of 280E. So if we're able to get a Schedule 3 or higher in number to where cannabis is no longer subject to 280E, the financial implications for companies it's giant. It's almost difficult for people not heavily engaged in the cannabis industry to understand the impact of not being able to take traditional business expense deductions, because you almost can't fathom a scenario where that's the case. Unfortunately, I think as large organizations have gotten larger and produced more gross profit over the last 3-4 years, we're really starting to see it materialize in balance sheets. And that has not only an impact on large organizations, but it absolutely cascades down to the small entrepreneur who's trying to raise capital to get into this space. It puts a ceiling on investor interest when they look at a business and say, well, if you can't deduct traditional business expenses, how do I get an ROI on my investment? Really, there's two channels, right? It's either access to some form of liquidity that'll allow me to sell an investment that I've made for more money than I invested in it, or a business is capable of producing so much free cash flow that they distribute it back to the shareholders. With 280E sitting on top of the impact of 280E on top of any operator, it basically extinguishes option 2 for an ROI. So again, on its face and within the four corners of the implications of 280E going, of a rescheduling, the largest impact on the cannabis industry, in addition, of course, to ability to do research, would be 280E going away. I think you could very easily, and not that I would want to go down this path, but you could see the soft impact, the intangible impact of movement at a federal level, and how that in and of itself could create momentum and help form the opinion on what's going to continue to happen at a federal level, or the potential for what could continue to happen at a federal level as it relates to cannabis.
Thank you for that. Howard, I'm going to ask you the next question and sort of combine a couple as the last question that comes in, as we're coming up on time here. But there are a couple questions that deal with how medical medicine is treated under scheduling, and medical marijuana and medical use for cannabis, and would that impact state level programs and sort of their judgment around that? And also, I think sort of an interrelated question is guidance for manufacturers. Would they come under FDA guidance under a Schedule 3 scenario as well? Those are just two questions that I think are prevalent. Yeah.
I think that in both those areas, the state medical programs and the manufacturing guidance and food. I don't think that rescheduling would change what FDA is doing now. I don't foresee FDA putting out a guidance on, for example, manufacturing regulations for cannabis containing food. The reason is it's not regulating it right now. And it's not going to be in a position to say, well, okay, we consider your food to be contain an illegal food additive, but here is how we're going to tell you you can manufacture it in a compliant way. That's not the way FDA operates. FDA could do something in the future that could be, and this has come up a lot in the CBD area, of some kind of enforcement discretion program where if you comply with the following manufacturing regulations, we won't look at you. The thing about that is that would then get the agency into the business of regulating the companies that are not complying, which is not something the agency has done. And there's, again, no reason to think that changing to Schedule 3 would make the agency want to take on that task. So I don't see it doing that in the near future. I also think it's just also hard to do as a matter of the way FDA works, which is when FDA is doing a guidance on something like setting up a program or how manufacturing regulation should apply, it has to do a public health analysis of it, which is hard to do given the initial step of the fact that it considers it to be an illegal food additive. I think on the question of, again, its relationship with state programs, I do not believe this change in scheduling would affect the relationship really at all, for the reasons I said before. FDA has the same authority and the same enforcement tools. It will have the same ones in 2025 that it has now in 2023. And so I don't think those things will change.
Thank you. I want to thank you. I know that we're up to time now for the program. I want to thank everybody here and all of the distinguished panelists that have talked and given feedback and also consideration for what is a very important policy issue that we see playing out in public right now. And I know so many across the wider industry and the broader public want to know about its implications. Here at ATACH's Capital Markets Council, we look forward to continuing to educate folks about what's going on, how it relates to the capital markets, and how people view it in the wider industry. And we'll continue to make that case here. If you want to find out more also about the case that we've made for capital markets and capital market adoption, we also have published a paper which can be found on ATACH's website, and we'll also send to attendees here if you haven't seen it already. So we're thrilled to have everyone out here, and we look forward to the next program. And thank you, everyone, for coming.
Michael, can we ask one last question? The
Sure.
last question that was posted. Do we see a scenario, to the distinguished panel, do you see a scenario where there's a bifurcation in how cannabis gets rescheduled, medical versus adult use? Or is that under any consideration when you're scheduling a substance?
It'd be very hard to do that the way the regulations are written, because you would have to do a separate kind of 8-factor analysis in determining that one merits different scheduling than the other, and look at different health risks, and it would just be very, very hard to do.
Thank you.
Great question.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for your leadership, Michael.